There's nothing inherently wrong with a tricky level. It can always be good to have an amount of challenge that, well, actually challenges you, whether that's a tricky puzzle, an intense boss fight, or some pitch-perfect platforming. Of course, challenge is a balancing act. Trying to make sure players of various skill levels need to illustrate their expertise with the game systems without creating a brick wall they'll just be bashing their heads against is an art that not every developer nails all of the time. On this list, we're taking a look at some levels, and yes, I've snuck in some boss fights, bitchy locations, and exhausting missions in here too, that were so awful they almost made you quit the game you were playing, and maybe video games altogether. Some of them are just that bad. Now, we've dug into levels like this before on previous lists, but I mean, video games keep serving them up, so we'll keep telling you about them. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 more levels that almost made you quit video games. Number 10, Manan, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Beginning with a level that is technically one mission on a larger planet, we have Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic's Manan. Specifically, we have the ocean walking on Manan. If you've fallen victim to what can only be described as the most agonizingly slow traversal in an early 2000s video game, you won't need any other explanation here than underwater walking in Manan. But for the rest of you, let's take a very slow walk down painful memory lane. Painting in stark contrast to what is otherwise one of the greatest RPGs of all time, you're at one point required to don an environment suit and search the sea floor area to complete main and side mission objectives. This is a totally intriguing concept, and Manan itself is one of the more exciting planets, with its cell-cath population, complex government, gorgeous vistas, and compelling investigation mission. Then there's walking on the seafloor, an initially interesting prospect that turns horrible as soon as you figure out that your speed is slower than even you would ever move underwater. It doesn't help that the seafloor isn't exactly a small area to explore either, and it's riddled with shark-esque beasties called Firaxa that you can only attack with a sonic gun. All of a sudden, you don't feel so much rewarded for exploration, but punished for it, as going too far in an empty location will require awkwardly shuffling all the way back. What you can do is cast your speed force power before you get out there to go a bit faster, and the bonus there is you will do a very entertaining super speed shuffle, but if you didn't know that hack, this one will bring back bad memories. Number 9, the Race Mafia. By all reports, this one was vastly improved after initial patches and in the definitive edition that came out in 2020. But back in 2002, this one was about as fun as shoving bamboo down your fingernails. Sorry for the visual. In the Fair Play story mission, you're required to sub in for an injured driver and win the Grand Prix in order to progress to the next level. In case you missed it, this is indeed a story-related level and not an optional race, so it's pretty much guaranteed to be a bad time for everybody. Before PC patches and the aforementioned definitive edition chilled things out, this race was absolutely brutal. Essentially, your 50s race car handles like a nightmare, so your chances of winning this one are low, and your chances of quitting and never even completing the game because of it are high. There are plenty of tips to help you out now, but this one's going to bring back awful memories if you tried to play it at launch. If you got through this one without needing to replace your keyboard and/or mouse, then you are better than us. Number 8, Maggot Lair, Diablo 2. There are a couple of classes that won't have the world's worth time in Diablo 2's Maggot Lair. For example, maybe you're a paladin with lightning resist, or you're buddied up with one. Or maybe you're not, and you have no lightning resistance, and you're about to have a really crappy time. While there are hindsight hacks like going counterclockwise to progress more quickly, if you didn't seek out tips beforehand, you'll be subjected to this claustrophobic insect and worm-riddled hellhole. There are 4 floors of this hellhole, and not only is it absent of joy and horrible enough to make you want to put down yet another of the greatest RPGs of all time, for all time, the tedium doesn't even stop there. As we touched on, one of the worst aspects of this particular level is the scarab enemies, who dole out waves of unavoidable lightning attacks that you might be able to sidestep were it not for the location, which consists of almost exclusively the world's skiddiest corridors. The whole thing sucks, let's move on. Number 7, Elysium, Hades. On our last list, we included the Temple of Styx from Hades, but you guys were pretty adamant that after managing to make it through Elysium, especially the boss fight that pits you against both Theseus and Asterius at the same time, you look pretty much ready to handle anything. While the poison was absolutely a barrier for a lot of players during the Temple of Styx, Elysium being earlier in the game means you were probably less equipped and geared up to handle it, and that's why most players felt worse about that than the Temple. As a result, you'll be less able to handle all it has to throw at you. And what it has to throw at you is the exalted shield dudes, tiny flame chariots, regular chariots, butterfly balls, and that's all before you hit those bosses at the end ready to clean your clock, assuming you made it through all the waves of mobs. It's a fantastic exercise in proving how well you've built your character, but for the majority, as proved by Reddit polls, this level and its bosses proved far and away the most exhaustingly difficult in the game. The underlings, the bosses, the oppressive length, this whole area is a brutal exercise that will either take you down or make you more than prepared for everything else the game has to offer. Number 6. Yas Universe, Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse. Dungeon design is one of the trickiest forms of level design. You want a sprawling area with challenging yet surmountable enemies and environmental puzzles all housed in an aesthetically interesting area. So it's no great surprise that often games don't get it right. Enter Yas Universe in Shin Megami Tensei 4, a confusing labyrinth that drowns you in a tedious and uninteresting maze before hitting you with one of the best boss battles in the whole game. While that might seem like a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, it's really more like a pot of gold at the end of a needlessly huge and obtuse dungeon, replete with confusing teleportation, terminals, dull ambient music, and way too many grindy encounters. It's initially aesthetically wild and interesting, but the novelty wears off, and the relentless pounding and shrieking of the soundtrack puts you into a sensory overload, where you fall into that if everything is intense, nothing is intense mode. Cool game, great final fight, terrible level. Number 5. Sewers, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Most of the games on this list are absolute bangers, including this one, but they're here to show that even a wonderful game can contain a crap level. Or conversely, if you prefer, even a crap level can't bring down the ultimate enjoyment of a wonderful game. Although they definitely try. The sewer level in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is one such level. If you haven't rolled a melee fighter, you're gonna have a rough time taking on pretty much everything. From the tiny nasties to the hulking ones, all of which are dedicated to taking a bite out of you. At the bare minimum, you're gonna want to go in with every blood bag and bullet you can get your hands on to make it out alive. Assuming you manage to either turn invisible and sneak your way through or brute force your way through, you're still left with a visually uninteresting, sprawling labyrinth of a sewer that's just no fun at all. In most video games, sewer levels are a drag, and if there's one thing we can say for this entry, at least it's keeping with the trend. Number 4. Cathedral of Sacred Blood, Code Vein. Now, there's something important you need to understand about the lore of the Cathedral of the Sacred Blood in the 2019 action game Code Vein. And let me be clear, this little tidbit of lore does explain why this one's so tedious, but it does not excuse it. The location was deliberately designed within the lore of the game to be a twisting and complicated mess to navigate, in order to prevent people from reaching the cathedral. Well, you certainly couldn't say they failed at that. Unfortunately, you're a person who wants to reach the cathedral, so welcome to one of the most irritating areas in video games. Even with a guide, this one is horrific to find your way around, so that's really saying something. It's riddled with tough enemies, it's enormous, and it comes with a fun break in the middle where you play through a flashback before getting chucked right back in. There are multiple bosses, and there's also a bunch of loot you want to pick up here so you can improve your gear and skills and get the good ending, so you can't even hurry your way through. It's initially quite pretty, but eventually everything looks the same and there are holes galore you can fall into that kill you instantly, just to top up the pain. Speaking of pain, let's drop into the next entry. Number 3. A Brother's Fate, Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. You'll notice that while we've done lists in the past about levels that made you rage quit or were so terrible you wanted to stop playing altogether, this list is a little more ambiguous as to what it is that's making you want to quit. In this case, it's a level that made you really devastated. Now, this entry includes spoilers for Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, a game that I have implored you to play before and continue to. So if you don't want spoilers, go meet me over at number 2. Otherwise, let's talk about sad stuff. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is the first game from It Takes Two developer Joseph Fares. It's a gorgeous adventure that takes two brothers on a wild and dangerous journey to seek a cure for their ailing father. Amongst the trials and tribulations the pair manage to surpass and overcome, a betrayal from what was assumed to be an ally results in the older brother's untimely death. After trying your best to save him in time, it ends up being too late. Your race to save your brother, the swell of the mournful soundtrack, and the younger brother's heartbreaking cries and screams as he's realized what has happened is enough to make you want to quit altogether. Not to mention literally having to dig his grave. There's also a cheeky insert where you see the older brother hugging the younger brother and it seems like everything's somehow okay, but then it pans around to the side and his corpse is on the ground. So, anyway, I'm getting a little sad. Let's talk about bad levels again. Number 2, climbing Sector 7 Slums Pillar, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake is pretty inarguably fantastic as both a remake and a game in its own right. When Wedge is on the brink of death in Chapter 12 and Aerith says she'll stay behind and help heal him, Cloud sets off to climb the pillar and prevent Shinra from dropping the plate. While the game has been fairly accused of padding its runtime, including a bunch of sections that don't really add anything to the overall experience, this is a good example of that. Even the security officers you encounter and then maim say they're getting sick of it, and that pretty much sums up the way climbing approximately 1 zillion stairs feels. There are some heavy moments between the respective fates of Jesse and Biggs, but their impact is undercut by the level's pacing, an issue that wasn't a case in the original. The heli troopers are a particular pain in the butt since, although you can zip up to them, you're primarily a hand-to-sword kind of guy, so you won't be doing as much damage or getting in as many hits as you wish you were. Not only that, but sometimes they fly out of the arena and away from the stairwell, so you just have to wait for them to float back to you. The whole climbing exercise should be epic, but it drags on for way too long. Eventually Tifa joins you, and to her credit, she gets up those stairs way quicker than Cloud, so he might want to consider not skipping leg day. Then again, now you have 2 melee characters against multiple flying enemy types, and a helicopter shooting at you relentlessly, so yeah, cool. Number 1, Gates Laboratory Levels, Mega Man X6. There are loads of notoriously unpopular and brutal levels in the Mega Man series, most of which came from the X series. While we're spoiled for choice in options here, we've given our top slot to the half-baked and infamously frustrating Mega Man X6. Honestly, the whole game is end-to-end pain, but perhaps the worst level of all is Gates Laboratory. To wrap this one up, here are all the things that are bad about it. And if you think this is going to be a short and sweet entry with a little list of a couple of irritations, you'd be sorely mistaken. Let's go. The stage is way too long for one, the initial area is caked in spikes that will kill you instantly, the enemy types are some of the nastiest the game has to offer, like Monbandos who can shield from damage, there are some near impossible areas to traverse without dying, especially with basic X, the mini-boss can only be hurt by a very specific combat approach, and the final boss kicks off between a bunch of tiny platforms that you'll need to hop between while trying to hit Gate with his own projectiles, and even if you do start to hurt him, he'll begin destroying the platforms. And yet it is still somehow more infuriating than I've managed to describe it. It's enough to make you want to give up on video games altogether, or if not that, at least Mega Man X6.